Welcome to the Library of the Jewish Theological, welcome to the Jewish Theological Seminary, right? You're not in the library, although once upon a time this was actually the reading room of the library. And we're thrilled to see you all here. This is part of an ongoing series of book talks sponsored by the library in order to bring attention to new and notable books. Typically, the series that we run is focused on new books being published by the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary. But this afternoon we have a very unusual opportunity in an event which is co-sponsored actually by the library, by Congregation B'nai Jeshurun, and by Next Book, to feature a book that touches upon pieces of our history and collection, along with other collections and a broader history. A truly superb book. I've had the privilege of reading it. It's, as you know, called Sacred Trash, The Lost and Found World of the Cairo Geniza. The authors will be speaking in just a moment. Before I introduce them, though, I just want to say that copies of the book will be for sale afterward, available downstairs. It's incredible how exciting what might appear to be obscure scholarship can actually be. There are several of us at the Library of JTS who give tours of our rare materials, and we are accustomed to saying something like, the Cairo Geniza is arguably the most important historical discovery of all time. Now, needless to say, that's hyperbole, but one might say that, like most hyperboles, like can't possibly be upheld. But arguably, in this case, it might be upheld, given the vast range and detail of historical discovery that's available from the Geniza. In this book, you will have the opportunity to learn two things. It is first about the discovery of the Geniza, but just as importantly, it is also about discoveries from the Geniza. And both of those are extraordinarily important. I can't possibly do anything to enhance the experience that you will have by reading the book beyond the way it's going to be enhanced just from the details. This was the first time in my life where, as a scholar, I felt like I didn't have to prove to anybody how exciting scholarship can be, because when you read this book, you will see the excitement of scholarship is just extraordinary, because the discoveries are often unparalleled. For that experience, I, and soon I hope you, have to thank Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole. One other thing I have to say, somewhere there was a miscommunication. I hope I wasn't responsible for it. They thought they would be able to give a PowerPoint presentation. I, unfortunately, thought otherwise. So there will be no PowerPoint, but we've tried to put some things together at the last minute, and hopefully it'll work out just fine. Adina and Peter, please.
And for hosting us all here today. And in fact, we'd actually, I think, really like to thank you and the other people who are responsible for the inner workings of the archive and library at JTS.
Louder, please.
Louder. Okay. I think that's going to be a little awkward. I'll just talk louder. We wanted to thank Ellen Castell and Jerry Schwartzbart and Menachem Schmelzer, who were really just absolutely indispensable to our research. Their patience and help and generosity. We could not have written this book without them, so thank you. We're deeply grateful. And as I think that list of people and this particular building should make clear, there's something a little bit odd about our coming here today to talk about this subject. It's sort of bringing coal hops to Newcastle. But since we'll also we're aware that some of you are only aware of the story of the Geniza in a kind of very sketchy or rudimentary way, we're going to try to give everyone their money's worth today.
Our title is, as David said, Sacred Trash. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. And here we are at the Theological Seminary. We assume that most of you are interested in hearing, or at least willing to hear, what we have to say about the sacred. But we suspect that all of you really want to know about the trash, which is to say how it is that a married couple managed to write a book together.
And how they'll present it right now.
But more substantively, as our book's title emerged, really, as the book's unconscious emerged, and I guess one of the really tricky things in writing a book together is how do good books come, we found, when they develop an unconscious. And writing together, would the book develop an unconscious that we could both work with? And I have to say that it did. But as that unconscious began to make itself manifest, the title emerged really quite naturally, and it made perfect sense, because as we started to tell the really remarkable tale that we had in our hands, which we started to think of as a kind of Jewish Indiana Jones, we came to see that our story was really a story of finds and near finds, and maybe most interestingly of all, rejected finds, all of which had at their heart the question of value.
So, now, we're going to have to do a kind of medieval PowerPoint, because if we had PowerPoint, we would show you this picture, which is probably the most famous picture associated with the Geniza. I don't know if you can see it. You'll all have to buy the book so you can get a closer look. This is a picture of what is and is not the Cairo Geniza, and we will explain. And as David said, in a nutshell, the Geniza is arguably the greatest discovery of Jewish manuscripts ever made. And important as it is, though, it's interesting that most people, at least most Americans, have never heard of it. At the same time, they've of course heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I would imagine that everyone in this room has heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that, despite, or maybe because of the fact that most scholars agree that the materials of the Dead Sea Scrolls were really the work of basically a small group of fanatics in the desert, while at the same time, the materials of the Geniza represent a kind of embrace of the world as it really was for the vast majority of the Jews of the Middle Ages. And it was with that sort of Qumran comparison in mind that one of the great scholars of this material, S.D. Goitein, described the Geniza, the contents of the Geniza as being the living sea scrolls, which is really how we've come to think of it.
So let's just jump in that big, or not so big, G word, Geniza. What is it? Geniza is a barely translatable Hebrew term, and I say that as a translator who believes deeply in translation, a term that carries with it an ultimate statement about the worth of words and their place in Jewish life. Scholars think that the word derives from a Persian source, a Persian word kanj or ganj, which means...
Excuse me, some of us can't hear.
Jerry, how far back should we go?
No, it's fine. Okay, that's good.
And now being back to the beginning of the presentation. So, as I was saying, that the word Geniza, it seems, comes from a Persian source, a Persian word, ganj or kanj, which means hoard or hidden treasure. And the word Geniza, as such, doesn't appear in the Bible. But in two books written under Persian rule, the book of Esther and the book of Ezra, we do find cognates. We find Ginzei HaMelech, Ginzei Malka, which are usually translated into English as the king's treasury or the royal archive. In the Talmudic period, the word Geniza becomes common, but its usage is also more peculiar. It almost always has something to do with notions of concealment or even burial or a hiding away in the ground, under a staircase, in a cave, anything like that. It can be positive. The rabbis talk about the original light of creation, which is ganuz, stored up for the souls of the righteous in the world to come. They also talk about religious texts, like some of the ones that David had out here, which when they became worn out or unfit for use for any reason, had to be taken out of circulation, and they couldn't just be thrown away. They couldn't just be tossed in the wastepaper basket, the medieval wastepaper basket. They had to be treated with a certain amount of respect, and in many cases, and put in Geniza. They required Geniza. Sometimes it would be buried. Basically, inherent in this notion of burial or of putting away was a fairly arresting and actually quite beautiful, and for some people maybe familiar, notion that words like people have a soul, and they need to be respected in that light. The rabbis say a couple of other things about Geniza. Not just worn out good things required Geniza. Heretical writing also required Geniza, had to be put away in this manner. Often by being buried. Basically, it had to be taken out of circulation. So in one minority opinion in the Talmud, we hear about, this is quite surprising, the book of Proverbs, the biblical book of Proverbs, the biblical book of Ecclesiastes. Some rabbis say it should be ganu, should be put away. Why? Because each of those books contained, and we have many editors in the audience today, take note, those books contain internal contradictions, and therefore could lead the unwitting reader astray. That was definitely a minority opinion and it wasn't taken up. Over time, to make a long story short, this notion of Geniza changed. It went from connoting a process, Geniza as a verbal noun, to denoting a place, a repository, the place where these texts are put, and summarizing the whole phenomenon, you might say, as one scholar has, that a Geniza served a twofold purpose of, on the one hand, preserving good things from harm, and on the other hand, keeping bad things from harming. The practice started, we think, we don't know for sure, but it seems that it started in late antiquity. It continued all through the Middle Ages, modernity. In the 20th century, we have not in book, but in that PowerPoint presentation that we're not showing you, we have a great picture of an Algerian Jewish community at the beginning of the 20th century conducting basically a funeral for worn-out texts. Texts that were taken out of their Geniza, brought to a cemetery, and then they would be given a certain kind of rites. There's all kinds of descriptions. Sometimes it would be very festive. There would be drinking, and there would be food, and there would be a kind of celebration, almost like the completion of writing a Torah scroll. It's still practiced today. We were just talking to David. JTS has its Geniza next to the Xerox machine. If you are Xeroxing something, a religious text, you can't simply, the Xerox doesn't work out so good, you can't just throw it out, crumple it up. It has to go to a special receptacle, and every 6 months, David said, these things are taken for burial here. There has been really interesting ethnographic and historical work, not all that long ago, by Mark Cohen, who may not be here, but we'll see him later.
It's right there. He is.
Where's Mark? Okay, Mark. So Mark Cohen is one of the leading Geniza scholars in the world and was a great help to us in writing this book. In fact, we could not have written this book without him. And in a groundbreaking study with late Adina Stillman, they surveyed Geniza practices all throughout the Jewish world and showed really just how diverse and various those practices were. In the Jewish Hebrew National Library in Jerusalem, you often find these, plastic bags with, we'll say, Geniza, Geniza, do not discard, and all these sensibilities also have to be respected.
So that is a Geniza, or the process of Geniza, and mostly what we'll be talking about today is really the Geniza, by which we mean, and again, we have a little bit of show and tell here, we'll hold that over. Probably can't see it in the back if you
have
can.
a skimpily clad woman walking around here between rounds.
Anyway, okay. Basically, what this picture is a picture of the Ben Ezra, what is now known as the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Fustat, or Old Cairo. It's the oldest part of Cairo. It's now actually sort of almost part of Cairo proper, but it's to the south. It is today, it's really a slum. In its heyday, though, in the Middle Ages, it was a teeming, thriving metropolis. And you have to imagine a place not unlike New York City, into which, immigrants flooded from all corners of the world, literally. People came seeking their fortunes and fleeing persecution. It was also right at the hub of various very important trade routes. Obviously, the Nile came right up to it and out, you could go out to the Mediterranean, and there were traders plying their wares from, as close as North Africa and Spain all the way as far as India. And so Fustat itself was an incredible hub. It was also the home to the most prosperous Jewish community in the entire world at that time. And now here it's worth sort of stopping to remind ourselves a little bit about Jewish history. And there's a way in which I think, even unconsciously, even if we know this, it's it's hard not to think of Jewish history, at least from an American perspective, as being a kind of straight shot from the Bible to the shtetl to the Lower East Side. This is something else entirely. During this period, and we're talking now about what's called the classical period of the Geniza, roughly the late 10th through the mid-13th centuries, 90% of the world's Jews lived in the East. That's actually a conservative estimate, which is to say that Fustat was not...
So a lot of people frowning.
Fustat, this was not some sort of strange arrangement. This was very much the Judaism of its day, which is to say that these were Arabic-speaking Jews. They lived a very cosmopolitan existence in the sense that they didn't live in a ghetto. They were not living in a separate part of town. They lived alongside Muslims and Christians and others, often in the same buildings. They had businesses together with them. There was a great deal of interaction. It was not always perfect. This is not a kind of, rosy, but on the whole, though, there was just a lot of interaction and things were basically quite good, if I can generalize fairly grossly, but this
Much more grossly than you usually do.
Okay. This particular synagogue, the Ben Ezra Synagogue, which you have to imagine as a kind of, I don't know if you could actually see that picture, but it's in a place with incredible painted ceilings and intricate woodwork and marble pillars. It was an Eastern place, obviously, this was the East. This was the synagogue of the Palestinian Jewish community of Fustat. It was one of 3 synagogues. There was also a Babylonian synagogue and a Karaite synagogue. And this particular, the main building was obviously a place of worship, but it was also a part of a whole complex of buildings that really functioned as a kind of municipal center, so that in the course of a week, every member of this community would have reason to pass through many times. It's where the soup kitchen was. It's where the rabbinical court held session. It's where there was an academy the students would study. There was just a great deal of coming and going. It's also where you would have seen your friends and your neighbors, and people would come into the courtyard and hang out, as it were. Now, on the second story, in the women's section, the women's gallery, behind the wall, there was this community's Geniza. For many years, it was only reachable through a kind of a hole in the roof, and in later years, it became accessible by means of a tiny little unobtrusive hole in the wall.
If there were a women's gallery in this synagogue, you might imagine, let's say, there are columns over here, and way over there in the back, and in the back corner, sort of where those vents are, imagine a little hole in the wall that you could only be reached with a ladder. That's sort of what we're talking about. A closet, a space behind that hole in the wall, and for reasons that are still really somewhat mysterious, this community put not just its worn-out religious texts, or let's say its heretical writings, through that hole in the wall into that closet, or through the hole in the roof into that closet, but they chose, and sort of scholarly, Mark has also written about this, but there's a diversity of scholarly opinion, but it seems that the principle of classification here was that anything written with the Hebrew alphabet required Geniza. In other words, that it wasn't the content of the documents, the text that was important, it was the letters themselves. The Hebrew letters themselves were carrying that holiness. And so it is that anything written in Hebrew, obviously, anything written in Aramaic, Jewish Aramaic, anything written, and this is really important and also will surprise people who don't sort of know about Eastern Jewry, anything written in Judeo-Arabic. What is Judeo-Arabic? Well, these Jews, as Dina said, spoke, Arabic was their mother tongue, and also lingua franca, right? They did basically everything in Arabic except for pray and write poetry. But when they basically sounded like Arabic, a middle register of Arabic. But when they went to write it down, which they would do for all of their business documents, all of their shipping, all of their commercial records, you name it, their letters, their personal correspondence, when they wrote Judeo-Arabic down, they wrote it in Hebrew letters. Just in the same way, so all of that material would go through that hole in the wall, hole in the roof into the Geniza, just like Yiddish, basically a Germanic language written in Hebrew, with some Hebrew mixed in, written in Hebrew characters. And in fact, this is also quite surprising, there were Yiddish documents that made their way to the Geniza. The oldest extant Yiddish documents come from old Cairo. It's quite astonishing. Of course, what do they have? Letters of Jewish mothers worried about their children. You don't write, you don't. Literally, it's in the book. Anyway, all that went into this closet. The closet turns out to be really the size of a kind of glorified walk-in closet. For those of you who remember Imelda Marcos, her shoe closet, I think, was a lot bigger than the Geniza, if that helps you picture it. It was basically 8 by 6.5 Marcos, so I measured this, by 18 feet, which is not all that big. And it's as if this Palestinian Jewish community in Cairo periodically would empty its collective pockets and desk drawers and file cabinets and jacket pockets into the Geniza. In the same way that at the end of the day we put our stuff on the dresser, and then after a while things become a mess and we start to sort through things. So they put everything written with Hebrew characters into that closet. Another slightly mysterious thing, we don't know why. Again, Mark Cohen's research here is important because we do see the diversity of practice. Not all communities buried their things in their Geniza. This community chose not to bury most of what went into that Geniza. Some of it ended up getting buried, and some of it was unearthed afterwards. But by and large, it all went in there, and because of the dry climate in Egypt and a legend that there was a poisonous snake guarding the entrance to the Geniza, and that legend that there was a curse which would attach itself to anyone who dared disturb the contents of the Geniza. It remained for 1,000 years as the community put its stuff in there. All that stuff just piled up and lay there pretty much undisturbed. And how it came to light out of Egypt and into the, let's say, the place where scholars could study it is really where our story begins.
And it actually begins with two very unlikely Jewish heroines. They were unlikely Jewish heroines because they were, in fact, devout Presbyterian Scotswomen, identical twin sisters named Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson. And when their names were put together, as they often were, they were known as the Giblus, a single unit, the Giblus, not unlike the Cole Hoffs. But these women were raised by a very forward-thinking lawyer father outside of Glasgow. Their mother died when they were little, and he basically raised them as though they were sons. He taught them to argue, to ride horses, and he also instilled in them early on a deep love of language learning. And he basically had a deal with them, and he said, if you learn a new language, you can then travel to the place where that language is spoken. So that this was a good incentive to learn a lot of languages. By the time they were teenagers, they had mastered several European languages. They traveled extensively around Europe. Their father died when they were in their early 20s and left them a large fortune. They each were married briefly to a clergyman, two separate clergymen. Both of the clergymen died fairly quickly.
Within a year of each other.
And basically after that, Agnes and Margaret devoted themselves to a life of travel and study together. And they continued along the lines of what their father had taught them. They continued to learn new languages. They were, as I said, quite devout, so they turned their attentions to Eastern languages, Hebrew and Syriac and Arabic and Persian. And now, though, they were interested in traveling to the east, and especially to Sinai, where they were basically taking photographs. They learned just before one of their trips how to use all of this, heavy, complicated photographic equipment. This is the late 19th century. We're talking about these were not little digital cameras. They would take photographs of old manuscripts and bring these photographs back to Cambridge in England, where they lived. And then they would work at deciphering what they had photographed. They also developed the film themselves. And I should say that in Cambridge, these women were entirely self-taught. This is, you have to remember that in Cambridge, women were not given degrees until 1948, so they were well before that. They really learned they taught themselves everything they knew. And in Cambridge, where they were obviously women, they were also obviously Presbyterians, not Anglicans, not men. They were kind of on the fringes of Cambridge society. They were, however, great party throwers. They were known to be very sociable. And their friends were basically Quakers and free thinkers and Jews, including one particular man, whose name will probably not be unfamiliar to many people in this room, a man named Solomon Schechter.
Even more of an oddball in the Danish context of Cambridge than Agnes and Margaret, the very Jewish, very blustery Schechter must have cut a remarkable figure as he strode down King's Parade. With his bushy, red-tinted beard, unruly hair, and tendency to gesticulate broadly as he spoke, Schechter had been known to set off in the broiling heat of midsummer wrapped up in a winter coat and several yards of scarf. An acquaintance remembered first meeting Schechter with his dirty black coat, smudged all over with snuff and ashes from his cigar, hands unwashed, nails as black as ink, but rather nice fingers, beard and hair unkempt, a ruddy complexion. One ear was stuffed full of wool hanging out, and he was always very abrupt in his speech. Another recalled that his socks never matched. His resemblance to a bag lady apart, there was, as another colleague put it, the magic of prophecy about the man. He also had, his wife would write years later, a genius for friendship. He loved people, and they loved him.
Since his 1890 arrival in Cambridge, where he was first given the odd title lecturer in Talmudic and later appointed reader in rabbinics, Schechter had gained the deep respect and affection of a range of the town's leading intellectuals, including the radical Scottish Bible scholar and Arabist William Robertson Smith, who arranged for Schechter to join Christ's College, where special kosher meals were prepared whenever he came to dine, the Africa explorer Mary Kingsley, with whom he much enjoyed swearing, and the pioneering anthropologist and reclusive author of The Golden Bough, James Fraser, perhaps Schechter's best friend at the time. The two took walks together several days a week, discussing as they rambled all things human and divine. Fraser himself praised Schechter as, quote, great in his intellect and learning, greater even in the warmth of his affections and his enthusiasm for every high and noble cause. By turns fierce, warm, brusque, tender, biting in his wit and thundering in his manner, the king in any society in which he found himself, Schechter was often described in peculiarly zoological terms. Now he was a demanding lamb, now an eagle or bear. I can see him in my mind's eye at the height of a debate, wrote yet another friend, rising from his chair, perhaps kicking it down and pacing the room like a wounded lion roaring retorts. Lamb or jungle cat, he inspired awe and devotion in most people. No one imagines that the formidable Agnes Lewis would not even have blinked as she sailed, however arthritically, toward Schechter that day in the street. And I just realized I forgot to set this up. I should have said that she was out walking and was feeling rather rheumatic that day. This is a May day in 1896. She bumps into Schechter, and basically she says to him, we actually have a picture of Schechter. This is a slightly misleading picture. It's Schechter in his JTS
You
days.
get the sort of prophetic mode.
Yes, you can see.
Round three.
You can't see his socks, but you get the sense of the beard. So anyway, she explains to him that she and Margaret had just come back from a trip to the east. Yet again, there we go. Okay, now we know. Oh, wow.
Just to add a little pressure to it.
So she explained to him that they had just returned from a trip to the east, and as was their wont, they had come back with a large trunk full of manuscripts. Sometimes they didn't just photograph, they actually would buy, and as I said, they had a lot of money, so they could do that. And in this case, they would take turns sorting, figuring out what the manuscripts were. This time it was Margaret's turn, and she had identified everything in the trunk except for 2 items. And Agnes thought that Schechter might be able to help. And we should say here that Solomon Schechter had been a child prodigy. He had said that he knew the entire Pentateuch by the age of 5. He was really a genius as a child, but obviously continued to be. He went on, he had a traditional education as a boy in Romania, but then he went on to Vienna and Berlin, where he studied the Palestinian Talmud, was renowned for his knowledge, received rabbinical ordination, also had a full university education and studied everything from Syriac grammar to aesthetics. He had a voracious intellectual appetite. He swallowed novels whole and philosophy. It's said that he learned English by reading George Eliot, which I don't completely believe, but that's what they say. And he was also an incredible prose stylist in English, really a great essayist in the Victorian mode. So, anyway, Agnes thought that if anyone might be able to identify these 2 strange scraps, it would be Dr. Schechter. So, she said, if you have a chance one day, perhaps you could come and have a look. Well, Schechter, being Schechter, wasted absolutely no time. By the time Agnes got back from her walk, about an hour later, there he was at the dining room table with Margaret, holding in his hands what Agnes would later describe as a dirty scrap of paper. Margaret said it looked as though a grocer had used it for something greasy.
Something like this.
Something like this, in fact. And as he held it, Margaret later said, I noticed that his eyes were glittering. So,
Big question, why were his eyes glittering? What he had in his hand is something like this. It was actually even greasier than one that he had. He had a hunch that it was something sensational, which is to say a long-lost piece of the Hebrew Bible, or the Almost Bible, which is to say a page from the Apocrypha. specifically a page from the original Hebrew of the book of Ben Ezra, or as it's known in Christian circles, Ecclesiasticus, which means the book of the church. And in fact, in the Catholic Church, Ecclesiasticus is part of the Bible proper. In the Protestant Church and Judaism is part of the Apocrypha. And this is a book that had largely disappeared by the Middle Ages, and it had completely, the early Middle Ages, had completely vanished. The Hebrew had completely vanished in the 10th century when it was last encountered in Egypt, for those of you who know, by Sajjad Qamar. The book survived, the Hebrew fragments of the book survived only in quotations that were scattered through rabbinic literature, and there was also a lot of controversy about those quotations. Were they actually elements of the original Hebrew, or were they in fact translations, medieval translations of some other translation of the book of Ben Ezra? We're not going to get into all that, but the main way that the book survived was in Greek and in Syriac, and in particular in Greek in a translation by Ben Ezra, the author of the book, by his grandson. How do we know that? The grandson very nicely wrote an introduction to the book in which he said, I translated my grandfather's book under the reign of such and such, and we know when such and such reigned in Egypt, and that turned out to be the middle of the 2nd century BCE, so we go back 2 generations, and we know pretty much when Ben Ezra lived, which is to say towards the end of the Second Temple period. The Greek translation is also responsible. The only reason we have English translations like the King James Bible, there was an op-ed piece the other day that mentioned the King James translation of the book of Ecclesiasticus, of Ben Ezra. The King James translation was made from this Greek translation. Again, there was no Hebrew for them to translate from. It's most famous because it was an unlikely pairing in English, because an unlikely pairing of the book with the writer James and G and the photographer Walker Evans in their book about Alabama sharecroppers, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. That line, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, comes from one of the most beautiful passages in the book of Ben Ezra, towards the end. In short, Solomon Schechter, sitting at that table, knew that he had something sensational in his hand, and it's also something that he knew would get him the attention not only of all the Jewish scholars of the world, but because of the place of Ecclesiasticus, the book of the church, also of all the Christian scholars of the world. And this was a man who was not at all averse to sensationalism. It wasn't that he had an enormous ego, which he also did, but it's that he understood how to use events in a larger agenda. And it's the agenda that's much more important. We can't go into all the details of the book. We go into great detail following out why Ben Ezra was so important for him. But let me just say 2 things about that and what his agenda was. Essentially, Schechter was trying throughout this period, in many essays he was writing on all sorts of topics, he was trying to paint for the world, especially for the English-speaking world, a vivid picture of Judaism, unbroken in its vitality and in its validity, through its gradual evolution and all of its transformations through the ages and into the present day. Because Ben Ezra was a fulcral text, which is to say, it came at the end of the biblical period, after the close of the biblical canon, and just before the beginning of rabbinic Judaism proper, it was right there on the cusp, and it had elements of both in it. Ben Ezra, he understood, was a key missing link in this sort of picture, in this chain of transmission that he was trying to get across. The flip side of this agenda, or of this goal of Schechter's, was that he was trying to discredit the leading school of biblical scholarship of the day, which came out of Germany and was known as higher criticism. Schechter, in a very famous essay, called it not higher criticism, but higher anti-Semitism. It was led by a scholar named Julius Wellhausen, who also happened to be an extremely good writer. The vision of the higher critics, we sort of again paint a very broad brush here, but their vision of Judaism was as a kind of history of a tragic falling off. It begins in the sublimity of revelation and of the glory of prophecy, and from there it's a pretty precipitous descent into the desiccation of the priestly rites in the temple and the institutional bureaucratic goings-on, and then just a complete degradation of rabbinism into the woolliness and even the fraudulence of rabbinism. So you get the picture. For Schechter, this was anathema. He said that the German critics, higher critics, were trying to argue out of existence the humble activities of whole centuries of men enlisted in the service of religious study. German dogs, he called the beer-loving Wellhausen, and his followers, who had perpetrated what he saw as a kind of vivisection of Jewish history, a cutting into the living flesh of Jewish history. We must recover our Bible, Apocrypha included, he said, from the Christians, and this was actually an old theme for him. The very first article he published under his own name in Germany in 1881 was about these essential distortions of Jewish history that were brought by anti-Semitic scholarship. In short, Schechter sitting at that table with that glitter in his eye, what that tells us was that one, in a major way, or Schechter, it was Ben Ezra that Schechter was really interested in, and not the Geniza, at least not yet. There was also a little bit, or more than a little bit, of institutional and personal rivalry. Schechter was at Cambridge. When the twins and Schechter discovered this one page of Ben Ezra, the first thing they did was publish an announcement in two popular journals of the day. They were staking their claim. They said that this page had been found. They gave a very rough indication of where it was found, but not enough for anybody to go look for more. But the people in Oxford, in the Jewish Judaica collection in Oxford, suddenly began rummaging in their library. Maybe they had some pieces of Ben Ezra there, and it turns out, lo and behold, they did. And so there was a race was on for Ben Ezra. There was great excitement, great tension. Matilda Schechter, Schechter's wife, who wrote a memoir, has an unpublished memoir that is in the JTS collection here, we looked at it here, wrote that when her husband returned from the library the next day, where he had gone to confirm his hunch, to check out that in fact this was, the same day, that in fact this was Ben Ezra, she said he was in a very excited mood, he was very pale, and his first words out of his mouth were, "Wife, as long as the Bible lives, my name shall not die."
That really, though, just tells us why he was so interested in Ben Ezra, and it doesn't tell us why he was so interested in the Geniza. And in fact, as Peter said, we know that he wasn't that interested in the Geniza. We did research at Cambridge University, and we spent a lot of time digging through the library records, and there's ample evidence that all kinds of manuscripts were offered for sale to the library. And they were advertised explicitly as being from a Geniza in Old Cairo, from a Geniza in Egypt. And Schechter himself marked these, proposed, sales worthless, not wanted. He didn't care. This was a few years before.
They kind of bothered him.
They bothered him. There was no particular reason for him to be interested, it seemed. We also know, and this also involves JTS, that a man named Elkin Nathan Adler, you saw if you looked at the manuscript, there's an ENA here. That's Elkin Nathan Adler. His collection is the collection that is here. The Geniza fragments are his. He visited the Cairo Geniza a full year before Solomon Schechter. He was a lawyer, he was a manuscript collector, he was actually the son of the chief rabbi of England, and then his brother became the chief rabbi, and he was a friend of Schechter's, as I said. When he went, he was given 3 or 4 hours to rummage around in the Geniza. This is in January of 1896. He was brought there by the chief rabbi. It's clear that the son of the chief rabbi of Egypt welcomed the son of the chief rabbi of England, and he was given 3 or 4 hours to stuff a sack, basically a Torah mantle full of manuscripts, which he then brought back to England and showed to Solomon Schechter, and Schechter was not interested. Although it is interesting to note that afterwards, after Schechter did become interested, Adler would point out the fact that there was a certain smell to these documents. What does he call it? Their distinctive odor, he says. Which allowed him to basically connect the dots between those manuscripts that he knew had come from the Cairo Geniza to that piece of Ben Ezra that the twins had showed him. That's one of the ways he connected the dots. There are other ways that we speculate about. There's other evidence of how he put the pieces together. But he knew where he needed to go. But he couldn't very well ask Cambridge University for funds to send him there because this was still hush-hush. He didn't want to sort of blow his... he wanted to keep it secret. This was something that he didn't want to share with the people at Oxford or other places. So, in order to stage what Matilda would, in her very colorful fashion, call his secret mission, he raised funds on the sly. There was a man at Cambridge named Charles Taylor who was a very eminent mathematician, an Anglican minister. He was the master of St. John's College. He was a serious Christian Hebraist, and it's actually important to realize that many of the people who dealt with Hebrew at that time in England were Christians. He had translated Pirkei Avot into really beautiful English translation. And he was also Solomon Schechter's student. He was actually 10 years Schechter's senior, but Schechter had a kind of tutorial that met once a week for faculty members who wanted to study rabbinic texts. Taylor was his student and deeply admired him and considered it, he was also a wealthy man, I should say, and he considered it a great honor to foot the bill for this adventure. So he gave him a few £100. Matilda packed up Solomon Schechter's best black suit, probably his only black suit, and off he went. Now, when he got there, something happened. And this is one of these moments of incredible sort of visionary imagination. And our book is very much about this, the way in which certain scholars have this ability to see the bigger picture. And what happened is that Schechter basically climbed up this very rickety ladder to get to that hole in the wall. And he took one look and he understood. It was Ben Ezra that had brought him there, but now he was basically facing the detritus of an entire civilization. And it really, he understood almost immediately, it seems, that it behooved him to get as much of it as he could and bring it back to Cambridge and start the process of trying to go through this. And you have to realize, when I talk about his imagination, what he saw in front of him was in no way beautiful or obviously important. It looked like a trash heap, basically. He has an incredible essay called A Horde of Hebrew Manuscripts, in which he describes what he calls a battlefield of books. Everything is squashed together, just mashed together, and it's all completely chaotic. There's an IOU is attached to a tract about angels on top of a rational work, and under that there's a Bible and a love letter, and it's just all jammed together. But Schechter understood that he needed to do whatever he could to get it. In order to do that, he had to endear himself to the rabbi, the same chief rabbi who had led Elkan in. And Schechter, I should say, was a very charismatic man, so he knew how to do that. He's got incredible letters to Matilda that he was writing almost daily. Those are also here at JTS, just a phenomenal, it's not even an exchange, it's all him writing to her. He misses her dearly, but he's also telling her what's going on while he's in Egypt. And so, for instance, at one point he says, it turns out the rabbi is a stamp collector. Quick, send me some stamps. He's going to do what it takes. He has to endear himself to
complains about the rabbi kissing him.
Yes, the rabbi's always kissing him, which is not very pleasant, he says. Going to put up with it because it might help him get the materials in the Geniza. And he also has to endear himself to these aristocratic Jewish families of Cairo. Now here I said that Fustat is a slum. It was already a slum then. And these families, the Katawis and the Moseris, these were not only aristocratic people, they were, one of them, the Katawis, they were actually Austro-Hungarian citizens. They renamed themselves the Von Katawis. And they had an incredible villa with a private synagogue and beautiful gardens. What was going on in Fustat for them at some level, if you want that dirty old stuff, you can take it. I mean, that's not stated explicitly, but it's implied that really what interested them more was the idea of establishing ties with an elite European institution like Cambridge. So they and the rabbi gave him carte blanche to take whatever he wanted, and as he later said, and I wanted it all. And so he spent a month rummaging around in the materials of the Geniza and packing up sacks. And in the process, inhaling incredible amounts of dust and being bitten by bugs, it actually took several years off his life. He came back an old man. You can see from the picture down there, he's very gray. It's said that this really damaged his health quite severely. He describes all this in these incredible letters to Matilda, which are written in this incredible hodgepodge of German and English. He'll say things like, our favorite, I must take a bath immediately. I am covered in Geniza schmutz, he says to her. And he'll also, again, combine his English and his German after being bitten by these bugs. He says, ich full of spots bin, and things like that. Anyway, over the course of this month, he packed up 8 big wooden cases, which we now know to contain something like 190,000 fragments, and shipped them back to Cambridge, where just after a few months, he got down to work in a special room, which became known as the Cairo room. And basically, it's clear that the stuff stank to high heaven, so that was one of the reasons they gave him a separate place to work.
Right, it stank in part because of the parchment, the animal skin, so there's that.
So he was working much of the time with kind of nose bag on, but in this famous picture, he's alone, working very hard. In fact, we know that he was almost always there with other people. He had a kind of team helping him. They were sorting things into different crates. Here's rabbinics, here's Bible, here's liturgy. And as they worked, this became a kind of Cambridge attraction. Everyone wanted to go see the Wonder Rabbi and work.
So, in the time remaining, we want to get a little more specific and concrete and give you two examples, just two examples of many possible ones, of cases in which scholars have really recreated an entire world by embracing things that other people had either overlooked or in many cases dismissed outright. One day in 1897, just shortly after the discovery of Ben Ezra, I think it's several months, a woman named Persis Burkett, very incredibly attractive, and she looked like she came off a Victorian cameo, went over to Matilda Schechter's house for one of her at-homes, or kind of open houses where she would serve tea to the ladies. And Matilda was going on about how obsessed and excited her husband was and what an incredible thing was going on in this Cairo room. And Persis really should get herself over there and see it while it was still all intact, and it was just incredible. And it turns out, Matilda was probably saying this to her in part because her husband was an up-and-coming Christian scholar of Greek, particularly early Greek, early Christian text. And so Persis went home and she told her husband, Francis Burkett, about all this, and he wasn't all that interested. Greek was his thing, not Hebrew, but she said, I don't know, Matilda's really on fire with this, you better go. So he goes, he looks at Schechter, shows him around the room, and he's still not all that excited. And just as he's about to leave, he's getting antsy, Schechter says, oh, have a look at that box over there by the door, there's some Greek things in it. So Burkett wanders over, and he picks up a piece of parchment, the thing that's on the top, and stares at it. And it turns out the Greek is actually very, very hard to see on that piece of parchment because it was a combination. What was on this parchment was a palimpsest. It contained two languages. There was an upper layer of writing that consisted of Hebrew, right? And let's just say the parchment was valuable. Middle Ages was valuable now, but especially then. You wouldn't just if there was a text on it that was no longer being read, people wouldn't either put that in these or throw it away. They would actually rub out the text that was no longer in demand. They would take a pumice stone from a volcano and they would rub it out. But as Margaret Gibson wrote in one of her books, she said, how does it go? There is nothing that does not leave its mark in this serious world of ours. And you could not completely rub out the underwriting, the first language. And so beneath what looks like, you have to imagine here, this is also where the PowerPoint would be handy, but imagine a Hebrew hymn that's arrayed on this kind of leathery field of parchment, a bit like a marching band, picture halftime at the University of Michigan against Notre Dame. The marching band going across in formation across the field, brass blaring, drums, you name it, right? Underneath it, very, very faint and bobbing up like underneath the lily pads in a pond, you could see a little bit of upside down Greek. That's what Burkett said seems to be very important. And Schechter, now he was skeptical. He said, well, I'm not so sure, but why don't you just take the whole box home? Look at it. If it's really so important, work on it, edit it, and we'll publish it together. So Burkett was really excited. He got on his bicycle, raced on, crashed his bicycle. He writes this up later, and he was knocked unconscious. And as he was coming to, he had this fear that he had just destroyed this 1,000-year-old document, but it had survived all those 1,000 years of the Geniza. It would survive Burkett's bike crash, and he confirmed, just as Schechter had confirmed, that in fact it was quite important. It turned out to be a translation of the Bible, of the Book of Kings and the Book of Psalms, into Greek, prepared for Greek-speaking Jewish communities in the Mediterranean around the 2nd century CE by a man named Aquila, who was one of the major Greek translators of the day, also important to the church fathers, to Origen, and he did what Schechter had asked him. He prepared it for publication, and within a year, they had published, and this is a copy, the JTS copy that was actually damaged in the fire here in 1966, so we can't really show you. But
it's a leather-bound. It was originally leather-bound. It's a
leather-bound, very fancy book. We have a copy from the Yale Library. The book plate in the Yale Library says that it was acquired in 1899, so it was published in 1899. This copy is probably acquired in 1898, something like that. It's big. It also contains incredibly vivid facsimiles of these palimpsests, as good as any digitized picture you could get now, so that you can read every little piece of Greek underneath the Hebrew. He was going to try to show you.
I want to be very careful here.
I don't know how much you can see, but
Very, very vivid. See?
it's in the book. We'll get to it in a second. And so Charles Taylor, whom Adina had mentioned, had orchestrated this whole trip to Cairo for Schechter. He wrote the preface to this book, and in the preface he noted in passing that the Hebrew upper writing is not without interest. And that's pretty much where things stood for quite a while, until a scholar named Israel Davidson enters the picture. This is somebody with an incredible life story. We also tell very much like a life like a palimpsest. We can't go into all the detail now, but he was born, just very briefly, he was born in 1870 in Lithuania. Age 18, he was trying to escape conscription to the Tsar's army, and so his family shipped him off to America. He was fleeced on board. He arrived in America, penniless, totally alone. He knew no English. He actually didn't even have a name for complicated reasons, which we tell in the book. He had to come up with his name on board before he got to Ellis Island. And he gets some jobs in the Lower East Side in the Jewish community, and then he enrolls himself. He has to learn English, so he enrolls himself in school, but not English as a second language school, as one might do today. This is sort of shades of the scholar, the very thorough scholar to me. He has himself enrolled in elementary school. So there's 18-year-old Israel Davidson sitting in the 6th grade in New York at the Lower East Side. After a week of that, his wife writes a memoir that she published. He decided that wasn't thorough enough. He had himself demoted to 1st grade. He wanted to start from the ground up. He worked his way up. High school, college. By 1902, he had a PhD from Columbia. He already had rabbinic ordination from Europe. His first job after his PhD is he becomes a chaplain at Sing Sing. Right? You can imagine this guy, this sort of arc of his career. And then in 1905, he is hired by this illustrious institution. Solomon Schechter had, in the meantime, decamped from England to assume the presidency of JTS in 1902. Schechter thought that the future of Judaism was not in England, it was in America. And so he was coming here to
Not in Europe at all.
Not in Europe at all, but he was coming here to do what he could. He'd been asked to come here. And to a large extent, he sort of Schechter left the Geniza behind, but not entirely. He took some of his favorite documents with him. That became known as the loan collection. It was very hard for Cambridge to get that loan collection back. It took about 50 years. But he brought enough documents with him to keep working on them. And in 1905, he hired Israel Davidson to teach Talmud here. Davidson was also very interested. He had written his PhD on satire in Hebrew literature at Columbia, and he was also researching medieval Hebrew literature. And so Davidson got down to work teaching, doing his research, and looking through some of these Geniza things that Schechter had brought with him. And in 1910, he finds a tiny little scrap of paper, 4 by 5, tiny little thing, completely innocuous. It's just instructions for a prayer service. And it says, at such and such a place in the prayer service, the following poems by X should be recited, and it lists the first lines of the poems. Big deal. It was a big deal for Davidson because he said that X was a poet named Yanai. And Yanai was a legendary figure in the history of Hebrew, but someone from whom we had only, at that point, one extant poem. One poem. It's a poem that many of you here who go to observe Passover know, by Hiba Chatzia Laila. It's a poem that's in the Haggadah and is recited every year at Passover. Apart from that, the only thing that was known about Yanai, except that he lived sometime before the 10th century, was that in a fit of rage, what we might call the anxiety of the lack of influence, he had a student who was very famous, an extremely gifted poet, much more famous than he was, and in a fit of envy, his name was Eliezer Kalir, he put a scorpion in his sandal and murdered him. Now, that was the legend that came up in the 12th century. The person who wrote that legend down said, I would say, God forbid if it's not true, or God forgive me if it's not true. In any case, that's all that was known until this little scrap, this 4 by 5 scrap, floated up in the 11th century, and so that piqued Davidson's interest, and he began looking. Was there more stuff? There was nothing. So he published that little scrap in a journal called the Jewish Quarterly Review, which Schechter edited. It was the first American volume of that journal. And that's pretty much where the matter stood. He continued every year to publish more Geniza findings in that JQR. And then in 1914, he was really hungry to go to Cambridge and see the whole Geniza collection. Maybe there'd be some more interesting things for him, like what he had just found. He spent the summer there. He didn't find any more poetry, but he did find some very interesting things that we write about, we'll talk about now. He came back to JTS, continued working, and then another one of these mysterious moments. There's absolutely no paper trail of what happened. If there was a paper trail, it probably got burned up in the 1966 fire. There's only JTS lore, which has been written about a little bit. But on one Shabbat, one Saturday afternoon, Davidson, the story goes, was waiting for some students to come over to his house for tea. And something told him to take that book down, that big book, down from the shelf. And we actually checked at JTS in the archives, in the Davidson archives. We wanted to see, is there any record of his actually owning this book? How long did he have this book? He had a little handwritten catalog that just breaks your heart, this little leather-bound notebook. It says, a short catalog of the Library of Israel Davidson, 1914. The Hebrew is called Chemdat Yisrael, right? Israel's Delight. Sure enough, this book is registered there. He had it as early as 1914. Anyway, he opened up the book, and there, right under his nose, where it had been under the noses of scholars all around the world and readers all around the world in every major library for nearly 20 years, was Yanai's name. That same feel, that sort of marching band array of the hymn, imagine this, the way stanzas are structured on a thing, on a piece of paper. In those days, in this particular kind of poetry, at a certain place in the poem, the poet would often sign his name with an acrostic signature, right? So the line begins with Y, the line begins with N, the line begins with Y. And it was right there in front of him 4 times in this book, and 4 times in another collection of palimpsests that he also owned. All those poems on those pages were by this poet, Yanai. And so he set about working on them as Burkett had worked on the other Greek. And within a year, JTS published 40 poems by Yanai, edited by Israel Davidson. And that was actually just the beginning, because after those 40 poems were published, another scholar, and whose stories also just breaks your heart, somebody named Menachem Zulai, and we talked about the book, was working in Berlin at a thing called the Schocken Institute for the Research of Hebrew Poetry. Our book is published by Schocken. Carper, the editor of Schocken, is here. Product placement. Basically, Schocken, who's another incredible figure we talk about, built this institute, and it was a kind of field of dreams. If you build it, right, they will come. If you build an institute for research of medieval Hebrew poetry, people will begin sending you manuscripts of medieval. You'll have a better chance of finding them. And he did. So Zulai got to work by 1938. He was working from 1933 through 38 in Germany, in Berlin. In 1938, the last Hebrew book published in Nazi Germany by Schocken Books was edited by Menachem Zulai, and it was basically the collected poems of Yanai. How many poems were there? 800. And so, we want to give you just a quick sense of what the fuss was all about. One poem, right? You can't have an event with us without at least one poem by Yanai. Now, all these poems these are religious poems. They're all attached to the cycle of scriptural reading, right? And this particular week that he's writing a new poem for, they wrote poems the way that Bach would write cantatas for the Cathedral of Leipzig. This particular thing is the episode of the burning bush. The burning bush is the symbol of the seminary. It also happens to be the symbol of the twins, the Giblus church. So the weekly reading that he's writing about is the burning bush. One scholar, and he writes a poem as part of the series that's also in an acrostic, but not an acrostic with his name. This is an acrostic of the alphabet, right, A, B, C, D. And one commentator has noted that it's as if the fire comes down from heaven to the earth, bearing with it the entire alphabet. So it begins with a line from the Bible, and the angel of the Lord was revealed to him in the heart of the flame. Angel fire, devouring fire, fire blazing through damp and dryer, fire candescent in smoke and snow, fire drawn like a crouching lion, fire evolving through shade after shade, faithful fire that will not expire. gleaming fire that wanders far, hissing fire that sends up sparks, fire infusing a swirling gale, fire that jolts to life without fuel, fire that's kindled and kindles daily, lambent fire unfed by fire, miraculous fire flashing through fronds, notions of fire like lightning and high, omens of fire in a chariot's wind, pillars of fire in a thunderous storm, quarries of fire wrapped in a fog, raging fire that reaches Sheol, terrible fire that ushers in cold, fire's vortex like a wilderness crow, fire extending, and yet like a rainbow zone of color arching through sky. So very much as Charles Taylor had said, the Hebrew upper writing was not without interest.
Okay, so now we're going to jump to mid-century and a completely different area.
And our last example.
And our last example of Geniza revaluation, this notion of things being reevaluated, things that have been devalued, being revalued. This is the case of S.D. Goitein, and I would imagine that those of you who come knowing what the Geniza is have probably heard of Goitein, whose name has almost become synonymous with the Geniza in a certain sense. Goitein was a German-born scholar of Islam and an ethnographer and a philologist and a historian. He was actually the first professor of Islam at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he described how in 1927, when he gave his first lecture, the entire student body showed up because they wanted to know something about the Arabs. And he actually moved in the 1950s to the United States. He was at Penn, and he eventually went to Princeton, where he did much of his work on the Geniza. Now, if it's possible to talk about Schechter as the discoverer of the Geniza, and that's actually a slightly controversial notion, and we've mentioned that other people got there first, it is, I think, possible to describe Goitein as the rediscoverer of the Geniza. Now, what do we mean by that? While we were working on this book, we actually were digging through boxes, cardboard boxes at the National Library in Jerusalem, and came across a letter buried at the bottom, which was written in Goitein's hand, which we've come to recognize very well, in Hebrew. It was one of these pale blue aerograms written from Cambridge, England, to Jerusalem, to his wife, in tiny little letters at the top. This is October 8th, 1955, and in tiny little letters at the top it says, Sodi, secret, top secret. And here we have shades again of Schechter and Matilda with her, secret mission, his secret mission. She described it as that. So now Goitein is writing to his wife Teresa, and he says he needs to tell her what has happened that very day. Now I should say that Goitein had been traveling every year, every summer, to work with the Geniza manuscripts at Oxford and Cambridge. He was then working on a project that involved the medieval India trade. So he was looking for documents that pertain specifically to that. And he describes to her how this particular day, the Cambridge librarian basically tapped him on the shoulder and said, Dr. Goitein, could you please come with me? And the librarian led him up several flights of stairs to the 7th floor of the Cambridge University Library. And as Goitein described it in his letter, there he saw actual crates as they were sent from Egypt in 1897. Okay, in his more official account, which he then published later on, he described how the librarian took him up to the attic, and there he saw a crate, quote, of dimensions I have never seen in my life. In huge letters, the address Alexandria, Liverpool was written on it, but also in another script, the word rubbish. Okay, now when Schechter left Cambridge, this was 1902, he had, as Peter said, left the Geniza more or less behind. There was a librarian, a very devoted librarian who was working with him in his years there, a man named Francis Jenkinson, who we also write about in the book, an incredible figure. But Jenkinson died, and Geniza mattered to him too. But he died in the 1920s. And in all the years since, no one had paid any attention to his materials. And worse than that, they had actually deemed them, in the words of one librarian, nothing of any interest or value, a hopeless case. And at this point, when Goitein comes into the picture, believe it or not, they were slated for incineration. Okay, luckily, he immediately saw what he had, and again, it's one of those moments of imagination and vision. He realized instantly that this was every bit as important as the original collection. There was the same range of materials, and it was in excellent shape, or not excellent shape, but it was in the same shape as the original materials. This find, which would become known as the new series, would more than double the size of that original collection. It's important to say that even Goitein had his blind spots. He was interested in this stuff and he saved it. Scholars in the 1970s actually ended up reckoning with the manuscripts that Goitein himself had pushed aside. And in fact, that became known as the additional series. So there's a kind of constant process of one generation recognizing what the previous generation had not. Now, what's really notable, though, about what Goitein did is not what he found. As with all of the scholars who we write about, it's really what he did with what he found. And in this sense, you have to realize that before Goitein came along, there's a way in which what mattered to scholars of the Geniza materials were what we might call major trends in Jewish pietism. This is a Victorian notion. It follows very much along the lines of Thomas Carlyle saying that the history of the world is a biography of great men. And it's not that great men didn't matter to Goitein, but there were lots of other men besides, and also lots of women. And the people who interested in him, his Geniza people, were a whole range of shopkeepers and Jewish mothers and carp pickle salesmen and beggars, pretty much every class and kind of person who populated medieval Fustat, and not just medieval Fustat, because the documents really do deal with the whole Mediterranean region. Those were Goitein's people. And in order to sort of recreate their lives, from these texts, he understood that he was already involved. Obviously, he was a historian and someone who was interested in documentary materials. And when we say documentary, we mean literally documents. He understood that he would have to turn his attention to this other category of manuscript. And he himself kind of wryly notes at one point that one particular catalog of a quite illustrious university library refers to a specific Geniza document as being a business letter and therefore valueless. Well, for Goitein, it was precisely those kinds of items: business letters, trousseau lists, the items of what a bride would bring into a marriage with her, wills, all of these documents that had to do with the India trade, every sort of document that was possible. So what he did was then set about mapping this region by way of these documents. And he was a very thorough, very Germanic scholar in the old school fashion, as I think Mark can tell us. Mark is someone who knew Goitein well and who was one of his leading, I don't know what to call you, Mark. I won't call you a disciple. Followers who's continued Goitein's work. And what he did, Goitein created something called his Geniza lab. And this consisted of some 10,000 index cards onto which he put all of the most minute details of each of these manuscripts. What does that mean? It means that he was, again, this is somebody I should also say, one of the things that he did in terms of revaluing the Geniza was to bring into the equation the Arabic language. In the past, the people who studied the Geniza had mostly dealt with the Hebrew and the Aramaic. Goitein began as an Arabist and was therefore able to make sense of this whole realm of manuscript that had not previously been recognized. So on these cards, he's trying to pick apart the words to figure out, because not all of these things are items that we would recognize today, all kinds of medicines and dyes and utensils and items of clothing. He does an incredible job with colors. You have to, during this time in Fustat in the Middle Ages, the textile trade was incredibly important. It was like investing in the stock market. You would invest in the textile trade. So there's a lot of indications of various colors. Send me such and such a number of bolts of cloth. And so he gets inside these words to figure out what are the colors they're describing. So we have, just for instance, there's a whole set of cards that pertain just to colors: partridge eye-hued and chickpea patterned silks, and then there are linens that are the shades of honey and lead and cream of tartar and gazelle's blood and asparagus, and pomegranate and pistachio, and it goes on and on and on. And as he's doing this, he's really working as a kind of pointillist. And this is how we came to think of him as we delved into his cards and into his work, and he wrote voluminously. Each of these little, each manuscript is a kind of point, a dot, in what becomes this canvas, this pointillistic canvas, which creates a whole world, the world of the medieval Mediterranean. And in the course of doing that, he charts an incredible array of Jewish ways of being. The diversity of Jewish life in the Middle Ages in this part of the world was intense. There's all kinds of controversy and dissent and division at the same time that there's a lot of communal cohesion. He also charts in incredible detail the ways the Jews are interacting with the non-Jews around. This is not theoretical, it's highly practical, what actually happened on such and such a day between such and such a person. But at the same time, he's dealing with everything that you could imagine, from the Tuesday and Friday distribution of bread to the poor, to the Jewish poor of Fustat, to the nature of the medieval Mediterranean postal service, to what it meant to have orders of payment, basically medieval checks. It turns out people thought that checks were a much later invention. No, in Fustat, they were already writing checks. He actually found one man in the 12th century who'd written 20 checks in a single month alone. He pieced this together, and again, these were not all neatly waiting for him in a file. He had to piece them together from collections all over the world. I mean, I could sort of just read you a long list of things that he touched on. In the end, just to give you a sense of what I'm trying to sum up in 3 minutes, This is Goitein's great work, his magnum opus, which, as you can see, is 6 volumes. It's an incredible synthetic work. He's not publishing texts individually. He's really attempting to piece together the different parts of this world, so that, you know, everything from messianism to homosexuality to attitudes toward afterlife and, you know, sleeping sickness and social drinking and the price of flax, you name it, it's in that book. This book, his magnum opus, it's called The Mediterranean Society, and he finished it just a few months before his death in 1985 at the age of 85. So.
And it is very much kind of Jamesian.
Yes, in fact, well, you can say it. Now, we talked about the fact, we were talking before, that in some sense, Goitein's vision encompasses, almost, we might liken it to Henry James's notion of the spreading field, the human scene. And in that sense, it's really not just, I think, about the Jews of Fustat, it's a much wider vision of the interactions of a whole range of people in a given society.
So there's a lot more we could talk about, including how it is that the Jewish Theological Seminary itself came to possess one of the most important Geniza collections in the world. Right? There are over 27,000 fragments here. They asked us about that. But we're about to turn to pumpkins, so we'll save that for the question and answer period. And we want to leave you with just one last sort of half story, to give you a sense of the ways in which this is not just some kind of historical story. The Geniza is, in a sense, the gift that keeps on giving. Just a few months ago, there was a book published in Jerusalem that was a catalog of recent Geniza finds. What were the finds? They emerged from a tin box that was found in the Swiss National Library about 4 years ago. And what it was there was a Swiss papyrologist who studied Greek texts. And I should say on the tin box, which was found because they were having an anniversary exhibition of this papyrologist's work, and they found this among his papers. And on the tin box it said in French, in handwriting, it says, these are Hebrew documents that were bought in 1897 in Old Cairo, next to the Ben Ezra Synagogue, from an antiquities dealer, and gives the name of the antiquities dealer. Okay, so, but the Swiss had actually come across that, and they didn't really know what to do with it. Luckily, somebody from Jerusalem, a scholar from Jerusalem, whose job it is to catalog all Hebrew manuscripts in the world, happened to be contacting the Swiss National Library for something else, and said, doing his job, by the way, have you gotten any new manuscripts within the last 25 years? To which the librarian wrote back,
No.
which is to say, it isn't exactly no, it's been here for 100 years, but yes, we did just find this box. It's got all these Hebrew manuscripts, and we gave them to a priest, and he said it was black, well, it's not very important. So, and immediately we dispatched somebody from Jerusalem. Turned out to be extremely important. It had wonderful Geniza specimens of all kinds, some great poems, really important poems, things of Bible, rabbinic stuff, you name it, the usual. It turns out, I did some research about all this, turns out that this papyrologist had sent that box with his son in the late 1890s to England. The son was, I think, in medical school, he was in college, seminary, and sent him to England with the box, thinking that the people at Oxford could help him identify what these manuscripts are. And so he brought them to these people at Oxford, and the people at Oxford looked at it in 1889 and said, worthless. So the son brought it back to Switzerland, into the father's collection that went, he died, into the vault that went for over 100 years. And that was just published a few months ago. There's some other incredible stories of really exciting finds that have also come out. We'll tell you about that now. But all of this together, all of these stories, combine in a certain sense to restore the etymological sense of the word Geniza that we started with, as a kind of unconscious archive or treasury. And it also returns us to where we began with Ben Ezra, and in particular to one line from Ben Ezra, which is one of our favorite lines, became the epigraph for our book, and it says, Chochmatuna v'otzar mustar, ma to'ela b'shteihem, hidden wisdom and concealed treasure.
What is the use of either?
The authors will take a couple of questions, so please, anybody.
Yeah.
When you comment on the Damascus document, which was found in the Geniza, and commented on by Adler and by Louis Ginsburg and others, for which they only had a fragment, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found it was a larger document.
Do you want us to comment on that?
In fact, how do you get something that is that old in the Geniza?
Yes, the short answer is we don't know.
No, we don't know. It's not known.
Yeah, it's not known. There are several.
Before you answer, I just want to clarify. What he's referring to is a document which was discovered to be one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was discovered before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the Cairo Geniza. So that's the question.
And as it happens, you find several things from the Geniza among the papers, the texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, including Ben Ezra, right? That is actually one of the proofs, that this is a whole other controversy, but one of the proofs that the version of Ben Ezra that Schechter found, that he had in his hand that day, that it was in fact the original Ben Ezra, and not some kind of medieval concoction, a translation from the Greek that the rabbis had made at some point. One of the proofs of that is that they found some of Ben Ezra in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yigaluddin found it and wrote about this, and it's almost identical, except for a few kind of scribal copyist changes. It's identical, so we know that that's the case. Now, how did the Damascus document is this sectarian, basically heretical heretical document. We have a whole chapter on heresy.
In fact, Schechter was fascinated and publishes the Damascus.
Schechter has an essay. Well, he was in a letter. He talks about how one of the things he brought with him from Cambridge to America was what he calls "my heretics gallery." He says he's going to shock America with this. Right? He liked this stuff, but it wasn't just that it was heretical. He had a reason for it. On the one hand, it shows just how incredibly diverse, and I mentioned this before, Judaism was, how many different streams and paths there were within Judaism. He also had a whole sort of polemic he was working on against Reform Judaism. But speculation, how does a heretical work from the Second Temple period, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, get into the Geniza? It would appear that it has something to do with the fact that there was also a Caraite, which is, let's say, another sect, and I'm going to explain all this stuff now, synagogue in Cairo, which also had a Geniza. And it appears that these Genizas exchanged, I wouldn't say, literary fluids, but things passed from one Geniza to the other. We don't know exactly why. It seems that sometimes they would use them as libraries. They would just kind of fish in there and see what they could find. And so it is that you find rabbinite documents in the Caraite Geniza, and in the Caraite Geniza you find rabbinite documents. But the history of heresy, as you probably know, was something that the Karaites were very interested in, or a history of sectarian movements. And so it may be that that's how.
I got this just a few days ago, and I haven't been able to stop reading it. It is the most fantastic, most remarkable book intended for a popular audience about scholarly things that I've ever seen in my life. And I have to give you credit. And I came because the excitement that's in the book, I wanted to hear from the two of you, and it's the same kind of excitement that I find.
Not planned.
So, I don't work for shopping. But what I wanted to say is that that insofar as the Damascus document is concerned and anything else, it might not have been impossible for Karaites themselves to have put their documents into this synagogue as well. It didn't even have to be a cross-fertilization. But what I wanted to add just briefly is the only remarks that you made, which I wanted to add clarification, is at the very, very beginning, not having to do with this exactly, but about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I personally, a minority opinion, I think that based on the Cairo Geniza, people who wrote about the Dead Sea Scrolls should have realized the similarity of the types of documents is remarkable, and therefore attributing them to one sect and to one group may really not be the final answer, and they may reflect the same kind of diversity that you just talked about that exists in the Cairo Geniza.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, there are people, many scholars who consider that maybe the Dead Sea Scrolls were themselves functioning as a kind of Geniza. You know, they were placed in jars, in caves. This is something that was done. This is another kind of Geniza practice that exists. In fact, in Jerusalem in the 19th century, that's what they did with some of their Geniza texts. So absolutely. I mean, that was, we were painting with a very broad brush. Obviously,
we're
there's
aware of
scholarly.
that opinion, and
But
presentation is a presentation. I have to budget you there.
Okay, thank you very much. Needless to say, we could go on virtually forever if you're interested in devoting your life to the study of Geniza, or many lifetimes, as the case may be. Right now, the authors will be retiring to a table downstairs in the lobby where copies of the book will be available on sale. I will be here with a few select fragments actually from our collection of the Geniza, which those of you who didn't have a chance to take a look at beforehand, I welcome you to take a look at right here. No touching, just looking. And thank you all for coming. The next book talk will be featuring a book by one of the seminary faculty, Bert Wysotsky, who has just published a book called Sage Tales. That will be on May 4th. Thank you for coming.